Yes. Okay. Richard will correct my memory if it's not true. There was a very important book on architecture which was outside of the dominating Western Hemisphere. It was called Architecture in der Dritten Welt, Architecture of the Third World. And I came across Richard there. And in that book, Charles Correa was introduced. Rasim Badran, whom you had listened to, he was covered there. And Sumet Jumsai from Thailand, and Richard was there. It was very impressive. Richard visited me in Geneva. As we were talking, my secretary came and said that jury member Robert Venturi will be coming the following morning, not that evening for the reception. And we were talking with Richard when secretary left, and Richard told me that, oh, Venturi has got the job in Trafalgar Square. So he was, he was following the whole thing. And then with that energy, we introduced a seminar in Malta on behalf of the Aga Khan Award, because we needed a country and a space where everything freely could be exchanged, because architectural criticism was a very important subject, but it's not usually openly discussed. And Richard has hosted the Aga Khan Award, I'm sorry, not me. And then there was, of course, a composition, you'll tell me. Yeah, and that was dedicated to Aga Khan Award as a symphonic poem, or as a musical poem. And then our friendship went on and on and on, and I visited Malta at least 10 times on different occasions. Recently we were there with Emre Arolat, and my last visit was a spectacular thing for my own life. And then he's here, Richard.
Welcome. Thank you, Sullivan. Thank you for all your hospitality. Thank you for your talents, but most of all, thank you for your friendship, because that I value above everything else. Also your mentorship, by the way. Thank you. You know, sitting in this seat, and I sort of bear in mind that there were people of the caliber of Pallasmaa, Rasim, and Enrici. So I mentioned those three. Yeah. So in a way I feel like a tenor having to sing after the concert of the three tenors. A little bit fearful. So anyway, I want to start off by saying I belong to an age when apples and blackberries were fruits, and a mouse was a rodent with a long tail. So that gives you the idea of my sort of age. But although growing old is mandatory, growing up is voluntary. I still want to hold within my soul and my spirit something of my childhood. Michael Ende, in his book The Never-Ending Story, says man dies when the last part of the child in him becomes an adult. So I want to preserve that childhood, the innocence, also because I believe that I'm an eternal student. I keep learning, I learn from the people I meet, Suha in particular and all the others. So also because when you get to my age, people talk about retirement. You can't retire. If you rest, you rust. you go to pieces. So no possibility whatsoever of this is a tribute to my island, because we live in a sun-baked island in the middle of the Mediterranean, and the sun creates the shadows, creates the form, elevates the form of architecture. And this is me, you'll notice later why, but anyway, I produced a sculpture called Love, which is reversed and reflected in the waters. And the cartoonist produced this, but I'm also a great believer in love. Teilhard de Chardin had this wonderful quote where he said, you know, one day when man will rediscover the power of love, that event will be as important in the history of mankind as when mankind first discovered fire. Now this is what I normally use when I'm speaking to non-architects. You know, trust me, I'm an architect. Regretfully today, I think the man in the street has fallen out of love with architects. Architects have become slaves to money-making developers and speculators. So anyway, trust me, I'm an architect. Then where does the profession, I prefer the word vocation, by the way. I don't think architecture is what I would term a profession, but a vocation. In Mark Twain's book, The Story of Adam and Eve, he says that when Eve first sets her eyes on Adam, she's not quite sure what he is. She calls him a reptile, but she says she has a special relationship with this reptile. But at the end, she thinks, I thought it might be architecture. And of course, the first architect, as recounted in the Holy Book, in the chapters of Genesis, is none other than Cain. So the first architect was the first murderer. He was also the firstborn. He was also the first agriculturalist, which reverses our theory that we were first roamers and now we then became settlers. So he's a settler at the very beginning. And of course he's the first architect because he builds the city of Enoch, which he names after his son. So what is it that makes one assimilate and makes one what one is? And that is what William Blake had said, we become what we behold. And in Malta, Malta is a land of stone. The sole building material is a limestone, very similar to, because it's sedimentary, very similar to what you have over here in Bodrum. And it's interesting that I'm very interested in the vernacular architecture of many countries. The vernacular architecture, which we seem to have forgotten, but if we think of the wonderful book by Bernard Rudowski, Architecture Without Architects, and sometimes much better than Architecture with Architects, we have a magnificent theory of how to use, in a maximum utilization of minimal resources. This one sole building material in Malta produces a typology of architecture, which you see here. Malta is situated in the center of the Mediterranean, midway between Europe and Africa. And if you look at the architecture of the cube houses comes from the south, from Africa. But then in the center you have the Baroque haunted dome, which obviously is the influence from Italy. So in a way you have an architectural typology which is reflecting the geographical position of the island. Then we have magnificent architecture in the city of Valletta, with architects who came over during the time of the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and mostly Italian architects, but also Maltese architects. But the most amazing thing which we have in Malta is, of course, the Neolithic temples. And these were built by people who arrived from Sicily on the Stentinello developments in Sicily 5,000 years before Christ. But the building of these extraordinary buildings, not only in terms of engineering, but also in terms of form making and spatial arrangement between areas and others. It was almost recalling Lucan's servant spaces and dominant spaces. So these were people who, for the land had more meaning for them. And if only we can, I always say, perhaps we still have much to learn, but perhaps we have more to remember. These were the people who discovered that they could get a crop from the earth, and therefore they worshipped a matriarchal deity, and but they also knew that what they planted and what they sowed depended on the movement of heavenly bodies. So many of the so-called temples, because we're not even sure if they were temples, were in fact calendars in stone. They understood time as cyclic, and hence a lot of the decorations are in fact what one would term spirals, so you get this beginning and the return. Now, of course, as I said, you assimilate what you grow up with. My father was an architect, so I was taken around and shown many of the places in Malta, and that's almost a physical data which you assimilate. But then you need an intellectual overlay, and the intellectual overlay came, particularly in my early stages, from three mentors. I was particularly lucky to be able to spend 18 months working in the studio as a student architect of the great Italian architect Gio Ponti. And in those days, when you worked in the office of a great architect, unlike today, the architect and the master would come to the drawing board and spend an hour and a half with you explaining. And each one of those hours was a master class. And so you assimilated. In reverse of what happens today, I have a grandson of a friend of mine in England who worked in one of the, I won't mention the name of the architect, but who worked in one of the star architects' office for 2 years. And I said, how did you relate to? He said, yes, I met him once in the lift. So this is Gio Ponti's wonderful cathedral in Taranto. And I learnt a lot because my stay there was basically for 18 months. 6 of those were spent working on the church, the San Carlo Borromeo church for the hospital in Milan. And you know, the wonderful thing was Ponti was editor of Domus. So, and this was the golden age of Italian architecture in the 20th century. Names like Giancarlo De Carlo, Luigi Moretti, Bruno Morasetti, Pierluigi Nervi, anybody, name them all, Gardella. And they all came to the studio because they all wanted their work to be published in Domus. And we were introduced to all these. So again, each one of those was almost a masterclass. I remember working on, after the church, on the Italia 61 pavilion, which Nervi had designed for the celebration of the centenary of the unification of Italy, and in Turin, and Ponti was doing the interiors. And I've often said that architects are extremely egocentric. I once said that star architects commit suicide by jumping off their own ego. And as a complete flip side to this, there was Pierluigi Nervi, and I said, Professor, I said, what should we do over here? I don't understand anything about architecture, you better ask Ponti. This was Pierluigi Nervi. How's that for humility? The other great mentor was the British architect Sir Basil Spence, who was the architect of the British Embassy in Rome, this is what you see here, and also Coventry Cathedral. Coventry Cathedral was important because it was at the time of rampant modernism and international style, and out of the 260 entries, his was the only one which took into consideration to preserve the ruins of the cathedral, which had been bombed by the German bombing in 1942, if I'm mistaken. While from Ponti I learned, Ponti had said to me, look, draw first, measure later. From Basil Spence I learned about making architecture. He was a fanatic at building model aeroplanes. It was also about making. One of the great problems in architectural education is it's all theoretical, but very little practical knowledge of how to make a building. Making a building is a multidisciplinary task, and that is what I learned from Basil, who also drew like an angel, and I'll talk about drawing later because I'm obsessed about this idea of drawing. And then one other guy who also came to Malta and lived in Malta for 40 years was the British artist Victor Pallasmaa. The Victor Pallasmaa was very much involved in this, what he termed the elimination of the non-essential. And the elimination of the non-essential put me in a position, and he always used to say, look, when you finish a work, you have a sense of satisfaction, almost physical satisfaction, besides cerebral satisfaction, but you are still too subjectively tied to your project. So you need to be able to take time, look at the project objectively, and go through what he referred to as a cleansing process. So in a way, you're almost going back to leaving the essential and eliminating the non-essential. He was also obsessed about what he called the harmony of opposites. And that is very much a sort of Japanese thing. But we tend to think in terms of black and white. In Japan, it's about the yin and the yang together. And he taught me about that. And he also taught me about the dialectics of space and form. These are wonderful mentors. But, one needs mentors. I still have mentors to this day. Juhani Pallasmaa, Suha, Daniel Liebeskind, all these extraordinary, Emilio Ambash, who I communicate with, and it's a learning curve. The important thing is to keep thinking and knowing that one is an eternal student. So the early works were really about trying to relate an architecture to two specific, and I think still very important items, which are place and time. Today, we relate to time, but I regret to say that most of the star architects are not really interested in place at all. I relate a story. I won't mention the name of the architect, but I was in Buenos Aires, and one of Jorge Glusberg, who was one of the greatest catalysts for architecture, I think, of all time. And there was this American architect who gave a talk, and there were all these tall buildings which are all warped and crooked, as they all are now. And he says, well, this is the one in Mumbai. Oh, no, sorry, this is the one in Japan. No, sorry, this is the one back home. And he came down for dinner, and I was sitting next to Richard Meyer and Mario Botta. And Mario Botta said, what the hell am I going to tell this guy? I said, don't worry, I'll speak to him. And I said, very interesting lecture. Yeah, man, very interesting. We have 500 people in the office, and I make a little sketch, and 4 weeks later we have a tall building, all done, ready. I said, oh, marvelous. And they said, where are you from, man? Which irritated me. And I said, I'm from Malta. Malta? Oh, Malta, I'm doing a big project in Malta. I'm doing Smart City. I said, where exactly is Malta? that sums it all up. I was very tempted to tell him it's an island off Japan, but so the early works were termed regionalism. Now I hate isms, because isms become wasms very, very quickly, so best avoid it. But it was about the tradition as the alphabet, form as the language, architecture is the poem, because ultimately architecture must be poetry if it moves one emotionally. So these were the early buildings, most of them early 60s, between 62 and, because I graduated, I came back from Ponti in 62 till 1970. So all of these were, the extraordinary thing about these is that none of these buildings still exist. They've all been demolished. And this brings me to a point of referring to the fact that architecture, although we think architecture is the most permanent of the arts, in fact it's the least permanent. Nobody would touch a book of poetry, nobody would touch a Pallasmaa painting, nobody would add a chapter to a book. The moment the architect hands over the building to the client can do anything he likes with it. And in today's terms, probably if the land costs more than the building, he'll demolish the building and sell the land. So none of these buildings actually still exist, which may be a good thing or may be a bad thing, I don't know. These are projects which didn't happen. This is what I would call architettura interrotta. And the extraordinary thing is that these images are more permanent than the real buildings themselves. So virtual reality takes over and becomes more permanent than reality itself. Il teatro dell'architettura was a term which was referred to my architecture by Paolo Portoghesi. And I love this quote by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, because I'm a great fan of The Little Prince, which has these wonderful messages. It is useful because it is beautiful, and you know, what is absolutely important is not what is seen by the eyes, but what is felt by the heart, and that is absolutely amazing. So here the idea was to try and create, first of all, silent spaces. Now this changes from regionalism. My approach now is about emotional architecture, about an architecture which enhances the spirit and enriches the soul, because space is mood manipulative. We can design a space which actually makes us feel elated. If you walk into one of your great mosques, there's no doubt about it that you feel, oh God, yes, something is happening. You walk into the Pantheon in Rome, there's going to be this feeling that, you know, it's extraordinary, something. So it's about trying to create what I call quiescent dreams in borrowed time, because today everything is in borrowed time, because everything. This is a garden which I dedicated to my wife, Miriam, which is now a garden for Miriam. And so it's about trying to create what I would term perhaps pastoral Arcadias. And where does the inspiration come? The inspiration comes probably from literary tales, Calvino, you know, all the great people who wrote wonderful stories of, you know, imaginary utopian spaces. But those are literary. There are very little of them which actually are manifest. But my, in a way of trying to reach an architecture or create an architecture which somehow or other lifts the soul. It's about, in one of Paul Valéry's wonderful books, Eupalinos the Architect, he speaks of a dialogue between Phaedrus, Socrates, and Eupalinos. And Eupalinos says there are three types of buildings. There are buildings which are mute, there are buildings which speak, but there are, above all, rarely buildings which sing. I attempt to try and make buildings which sing. I don't know whether I succeed. But because at the end, it's how the geography of the mind the geography of the space influences the geography of the mind. Because, as I said before, space is mood manipulative. All we have to remember is that the first definition, I'm not defining what these works are, because, you know, Oscar Wilde used to say, the necessity of an explanation is a sign of weakness in the text, so that's perhaps not having a description of what they is. But the earliest definition of architecture comes from the Roman architect Vitruvius. And Vitruvius had said that architecture is commodity, firmness, delight. Now, commodity and firmness are actually about construction. It's what he terms venustas, which we don't quite know whether it's beauty, but it's not something which you add over. It's something which is inherent in the building and the space one is creating. So it's that venustas which lifts construction into the realm of architecture or art, and that is extremely important. So because we have to remember, and Juhani Pallasmaa taught us about all this in The Eyes of the Skin, that architecture is actually experienced haptically. This is a building which now is in the last phase of construction. It will be inaugurated in March. And so Juhani Pallasmaa has told us that, we see a building, we smell a building, we touch a building, we hear a building. And in fact, there's this wonderful phrase in one of his books. He says, when I went to the Parthenon, and as I walked around the Acropolis, I had a great urge to taste the marble, which I think is absolutely marvelous. So it's about trying to create an architecture that enhances the spirit. And because in a way it recalls, remember that architects in the olden days were magicians, they were myth makers, they were high priests, they were shamans. Today architects have become, I'm afraid, tools for speculators on the whole. So it's, as I said before, it's an architecture to evoke the literary tales of Borges, C.S. Lewis, Thomas More, Holbein. And the influences, apart from the literary ones, the paintings of Giorgio de Chirico, the architecture of who I think was the greatest architect of the 20th century, which would be Luis Barragan from Mexico. So it's creating thresholds between reality and dream. So, Now, the most difficult task for an architect is surely to create a sacred building. I was very lucky because when I came back from the period of study and work in Milan, which I was also attending the Polytechnic, my father, who was an architect, said, I had a very encouraging letter from Gio Ponti, which I sort of flagged in front of my father and sort of say, look, I've done well. And my father said, oh, that's absolutely perfect. I'm going to give you a present. I'm not going to give you money, and I'm not going to give you an object. But 5 days ago, I got a commission to build a little church in a village called Manicata on the north side of the island. It's yours. It was a sort of handing over to the baton. And so I started thinking about how to create this. My father never interfered. He followed. Unfortunately and regrettably, he didn't see the completed building because it took 12 years in the making. The interesting thing was, of course, that when I showed the project to the villagers, because the villagers were incapable of reading, they were illiterate, so that immediately to me seemed to be a great and serious problem because they couldn't read plans. In fact, at the end, it turned out to be a wonderful lesson. For the one time in my life, I made a building with my hands. And I always tell my students, once in your lifetime, make a building with your hands, because you understand that I picked the stone and I would ask the guy to cut it. It was almost like a medieval master builder. And that's an experience which stays with me into these days. But I was interested, again, in an architecture of place and time. Before, first of all, the villagers hated the design because they wanted a dome larger than the adjacent village's dome. Mine has to be bigger than yours. It's sort of human nature. I was more interested in trying to create, this is exactly pre-Vatican II, so a relationship between the congregation and the celebrant. Because before, the congregation were spectators. And I wanted to make sure that they were no longer spectators, but that they became participants. Hence the plan which the two embracing between the guy who was celebrating and the congregation. The origins, probably, again, not consciously, but the Neolithic temple plans. This was a unique photograph which I managed to take of because it was a farming community, and it became the sort of joke when the book which Charles Knevitt did on my works, Connections, there was Charles Knevitt, myself in the centre, and Dennis Sharp on the other side. The origins, of course, also are the dry corbel, dry stone corbel huts of Malta, and the interior of the church. Another person who, of course, was the head of the church in Malta, who took a complete aversion to the church, was the 86-year-old archbishop, who said, "This looks like a German submarine." And so that was a great, but there were two people in the committee who fought for it, and we managed to get it passed. But then there was this, I'll tell you this lovely little anecdote. You see the stone wall behind the altar, which is basically a field wall. And when I went down and I said, "Look, would you come and bless the church and the inauguration?" He said, "Well, I'm not sure." He said, I don't really like that church very much." He said, "I'll come and visit it." And as we were walking by, he looked at this stone wall and he said, "You can't have a field wall in a church." And I said, "Well, in 2 weeks' time, this guy will forget." So I said, "Don't worry, Your Grace." I said, "It will be plastered." Which, of course, I had no intention of plastering it. 2 weeks later, we had the opening of the church, and I was walking him in. He was on a cane, and as we walked by, he grabbed my arm and he said, "Young architect, I see it has become very difficult to find plasterers in Malta." It was and I've always treasured that, because it's what a polite way of saying, you know, if you think you've taken me for a ride, you haven't. This was a monastery which we were going to build adjacent to the church. Now, you know, sacred architecture, if we had to write the history of building and architecture, we could do it through sacred architecture, and we could do it for architecture of the afterlife, because man has always been interested, not so much where he has come from, but where he is going to. So, you know, all the great tombs, I mean, all the great churches, these could actually be enough for us to study the whole panorama of the history of architecture. These are various sacred spaces which I've designed. The important thing also is, when you're designing a sacred space, I think there are two things which are important. One is the threshold, because you cannot go from secular space to sacred space without a sense of preparation. So the threshold is, to me, a very important stepping stone between because you're not outside and you're not inside, you're somewhere in between. And the other thing is, how do you actually design a sacred space? I have this theory that it's about love again. The amount of love you put into a building is somehow absorbed by the materials and sort of relayed back to the users of that particular space. Mother Teresa has this wonderful phrase. She says, "Not so important what you do, but how much love you put into the doing." So these are various other projects. This was a project for Poland, but we dug a big hole and that's all that's left. And this was a church for Cimeri in Reggio Calabria. Again, a very simple modernist church. And this is a project which I'm still working on. One of the things which has always worried me is the wars between the different religions. And ironically, the worst conflicts are between the three monotheistic religions. The three religions which believe in the same God but have perhaps different pathways to actually communicate with him. And yet, Malta, in the center of the Mediterranean, and most of these conflicts are in the Mediterranean, I decided to propose to the authorities in Malta, still not approved in brackets, a project which I call the Triangle of Peace, which is a synagogue, a mosque, and a Christian chapel, with a meeting place in the middle, where we're not going to unite the three monotheistic religions, but what we're going to do is at least have a handshake of friendship between the three of them. This was a project also called the Temple of Faith, of Interfaith, and this was a little garden which this was a project which had, I call it Chapels of the Rainbow, the 7 colours of the rainbow. And this was an idea of what you see at the end of one's life. And this is a church which we're still battling to try and get built. And the island of Filfla, which is on the south of the island, was a sacred altar to the people who built the Neolithic temples. And in the millennium, I thought it would be a good idea to try and Christianize this icon by putting a cross, by digging into the rock, and from the sea you could just see that. This is a mortuary chapel which I did for a client, and this is a true story. And the guy wrote me a letter, and he said, "Dear Richard, I'm delighted with the design you have prepared for my mortuary chapel. In fact, so much so I'm dying to move in." Now, mnemonic layering. Now, you see, memory is one of the most important things. How do we relate? When you relate to place, you relate to memory. And to know a place, one must know its memories. One of the things I found extremely difficult when I was working in Iraq, because Malta I know by heart, but I mean to relearn the actual memories of the place. And of course Baghdad had all its extraordinary memories. This was the extension to the University of Malta. And here I was very interested in what I would term the silent spaces between the building, where the space between the building becomes almost more important than the building itself. Because silence, you know, it's the silent beat which makes the drum beat. And silence is, I have the great honor of meeting John Cage, who of course wrote the famous 433 piece, which was to prove, because when I spoke to him, I said, "You tried to write a silent piece." He said, "No, on the contrary. What I tried to do was to prove that silence does not exist, because the ambient noises were in fact the concert." And he went into an anechoic chamber to try and experience complete silence. And to his frustration, he told me, he had one noise which I could not eliminate. He had his own heartbeat. So he couldn't eliminate that. There's various other views of the university. And this is the great capital city of Malta, Valletta. And I had done a master plan for the entrance, which was then I handed over to Renzo Piano, who did a magnificent job. Because Renzo, again, is one of the few star architects who actually relates to the place and the memory. And in fact, the Parliament building, which is he designed just inside the entrance gate, is where he's used local stone. And I said, only an architect of the caliber of Renzo could change Malta stone into Malta lace, because it's so delicate. This was the Central Bank of Malta, which is in the fortification. So in fact, the only way you can see it is because from the top, because there are times, you know, when the architect needs to be bold, but more often he needs to be humble. He needs to listen to the site. And if he's a sensitive, or he or she is a sensitive architect, the site will tell them what it wants to become. The site, the context of a place is what? Two things. One is the brief, because architecture is a servient art. And the brief is essentially, the clearer the brief. In fact, when I was working in Iraq, Rifat Chadirchi had suggested that the architects working on the project were also part of the group preparing the brief. Because he said, if you are part of the problem, you are more likely to produce a better solution to that particular problem. And I think that is something which is absolutely essential. And here I have the project, the Millennium Project in Malta, which was an old fortification built by the knights as a land defensive things. And there are the three stages. The first one at the top is the time when it was actually built by the Roman architect Laparelli, and then continued by the Maltese architect Girolamo Cassar. The one on below with the two holes, which are the cisterns, which was added by the British forces in the 19th century, and then there was my own intervention. So I wanted to make sure that when one walked through this building, one actually was able to experience the layering, because the important thing is, how does the building relate its own narrative? So architecture, in a way, becomes not a noun, but a verb. And in fact, in the staircases, as you go up, there are holes which show the way the original building was built. So it's about recounting how a building was made, its history, its layers, so it tells its own story. Sorry, this was Malta had an opera house in the 19th century and early 20th century, which was considered to be a stepping stone to La Scala, and a lot of eminent singers, because I've got a passion for opera and especially tenor voices. And this building was designed by Edward Middleton Berry, who was also the architect of Covent Garden Opera House in London. And although it was an architecture which in a way was imposed over the city of Valletta, because it was a neoclassical building which had no relationship to the context of Valletta, but it was a very popular building, and it was destroyed during the Second World War by German bombing. And there was 3 competitions, which I won the 3 of them, but then nothing got built. And I used the facade, the Barry facade with the colonnade, as a sort of memory screen to a completely new building. And on the same site, later, I proposed a parliament building, and using the motifs of doors and windows designed by Girolamo Cassar for the palaces in Valletta, but I placed them on a glass wall as opposed to a masonry wall. It's also the idea of having a parliament which is transparent. Now, to come to drawing.
Is that for Malta?
Drawing, for me, I think is one of the most important things. You see, I don't now use cameras anymore. First of all, I belong to the generation when a camera had 12 frames. I had my Rolleiflex, which had been given to me by my father, and you were very careful not to waste any one of those 12 frames. Today, with digital cameras and things and whatnot, you take 300 photographs, you put 5 into the computer, the rest are lost, and even the 5 in the computer. So you don't even have a physical image which you can. So to me, the idea that when you draw something, what you do is you assimilate all the building, or all whatever it is you're looking at, but you don't draw each and every stone. So then again you go through the process of what Victor Passmore had said, the process of the elimination of the non-essential. And you draw the essence of the building. This is Piazza Navona, this is one of the Italian towns, and this of course you recognize. So I tend to do very preliminary sketches and then continue them when I get to my studio. These are Malta scenes, but you know, I still believe that whatever computer technology has given us, that the bridge between mind and paper is still best crossed by the hand. So I still keep telling my students, learn how to draw. I mean, I have a guy who's helping me with one of the things, and I say, look, the site is 80 meters by 90 meters. And he brings out his computer. I said, for hell, I'm asking you to draw a bloody rectangle, 2 lines at right angles. You need a computer, you know. So, you know, and then the mind is becoming, and the hand are becoming lazy, unfortunately, because, you know, even when I said, okay, 5 by 7, so calculator. You don't know what 5 by 7 is? You need a calculator? This is a church, the church in Cimeri, and this is an illustration for my book on Kane, because I wrote a book on Kane as the first architect, and this is what my imaginary idea of what the town or city of Enoch might have looked like. Then I did this series of metropoli. These are imaginary cities, which are. I recently had a cataract operation, and when I went to the ophthalmologist, I said, "But why do I get a cataract?" He said, "Go and look at the drawings you've done, and you'll find out." So these are various of these cities which are quite crazy. And this is a little sculpture which I did in Malta. It's called White Shadows. It's the only figures which cast white shadows, and it's a popular playground for kids, and so it's great fun. And then this was an up and down thing about reflections in the water, and these are illegal immigrants because we have a lot of them in Malta, but who come here and are welcome because they're in the garden of the presidential palace, and because of the sunlight they become coloured. Because somebody once asked me, "But why are your sacred spaces so colourful?" And I said, "Do you imagine that if you went to heaven it is in black and white?" I doubt it. That's a sculpture for Romania, and this is the sculpture, the love sculpture with the reflection in the water. And now just a few words about where are we going in the future. You know, 8 billion people live on this planet, and by the year 2050, 70% of those will be living in new towns or in old towns, refurbished. So we need to rethink radically of what is this town going to offer. Are we still going to have cars running all over the place? We need to rethink radically, because you know, one of the things which I don't think many people realize is that when the last river runs dry, when the last piece of soil no longer gives us crops, and when we have poisoned the oceans and we can no longer eat the fish, we will find that we cannot eat our money. Because today everything is money oriented. We live in an age where we know the price of everything and the value of nothing. I still believe in the words of great poets and writers like Tennessee Williams. I don't want reality, I want magic. And C.S. Lewis. While others were building ships in their bottles, I was attempting to build a lighthouse. And ultimately, the best non-pollutive project for the future would be one where the floor is the earth, the walls are the wind, and the ceiling is the sky. Thank you.
May I ask you something?
With pleasure.
Have you ever been to the Rothko Chapel in Houston?
Yes. Amazing.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
Amazing. That
I
is
thought that you were going to speak about that.
space being more manipulative with these great campuses. Amazing. But there are so many places, you know, which one somehow or other visits and they remain in one place which I really cannot get out of my mind is the tomb, Hatshepsut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, Deir el-Bahri, by the Egyptian architect Senamut. Senamut was an extraordinary character, and in his tomb, which was very low, it was plastered over, and a very tall American archaeologist walked in and hit the thing, and part of the plaster fell off. And they peeled off the plaster, and they found a complete plan of all the planets and stars and everything, with an inscription at the end which said, "I know of all things from the beginning of time to today." So, you know, the ancients knew something which somehow we seem to have forgotten. So, you know, it is more important for us not to solely learn more, but perhaps to remember more.
The Rothkos are at the moment in the Tate Gallery in
Yeah.
London.
Yeah.
Amazing, isn't it?
No, that's an amazing.
Yeah, it's
And that's,
really
you know, once in a while you get these
Yeah.
geniuses who produce
Yeah.
work I mean, it's one of the spaces which is the Cornaro Chapel by Bernini in Rome, which is a theatre which is absolutely amazing, where there's the famous sculpture of Saint Teresa in ecstasy, which is almost erotic. It's one of the most beautiful sculptures I've ever seen.
Yes.
And you know, but that's the wonderful thing. I love Italy because of the continuous presence of the past. I mean, you walk through the streets of Florence and you touch Giotto, you touch Brunelleschi, you touch Ghiberti's doors, but they're not in a museum. They're there, part and parcel of everyday life. And that's the wonderful
Yeah, they
thing.
are in churches.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you visit? Did you have time to visit the castle
Yes, of course.
with all its layers?
Good, with all its layers again.
Yeah.
And that's before they came to Malta, before the order of St. John of Jerusalem came to Malta.
Yeah.
Because then in 1530 they arrived in Malta. And that's probably the area. But it's all, it's all about layering. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you.
My pleasure, sir. It is a little moment and Richard, we have been hugging each other on emails.
Yeah.
Now it's time to real hug.
Now, from virtual reality to reality.
As usual, we have our offerings, and if it is not raining outside, it is raining inside. I thank you all for coming. It's a wonderful audience.
Thank you for you. Thank you.
Okay, and next time we'll have Mahmoud Shenol again on the 9th of December. And cheers.
Abi bu alkış sizin için.
Canım benim.
Ben karşılaşırım.
It's good, good one.
Can I give her this as a token of appreciation?
Thank you very much. Richard, I could speak hours about cake because I'm not, you know, I think that he's really the beginning of this terrible war.
But you know.
He slaughtered his brother.
Yes, but
That was the first one.
yes, I wrote a book and I tried to redeem a little bit of Cain. Let me tell you why.